Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Australian Grand Prix instant reaction video stream audio podcast. However you're enjoying, I hope you're enjoying this at least. However you're joining me for this short show. Well, eventually we got to the end of the Australian Grand Prix and the winner was Max Verstappen, to the shock of absolutely nobody. But how we got there was particularly interesting. So let's dive straight in. And we've got the chat up on the screen now. You can rate the race or the carnage out of 10. I'm going to kick it off. I'm going to give the race a 7 out of 10. I thought it was actually quite an interesting race. There was enough going on to, like, sort of down the field to make it a bit more interesting without the fight at the front. Obviously, Verstappen was well in control once he took the lead. And he was always going to take the lead. He would have found a way past Hamilton with the DRS eventually, even if Russell was ahead. And then he'd have just breezed past Russell. Maybe even in the same lap, he'd have started the lap third and finished it first. And this is that's the problem as well with these multiple DRS zones where there's just a single detection point. If the driver behind gets passed in the first zone, then it becomes almost it's essentially a no contest. In the second one, there's no opportunity for the driver who started that phase in the lead to fight back, unless they get a really good exit and they play it really well. But when you're up against the Red Bull, it's very, very, very difficult to do that, whatever way you play it. So get your ratings for the race in the chat, or if you're watching or listening after the fact, stick it in the comments. Send me a tweet at AHGPPod on Twitter. So I think the big story is, well, of course, the red flag chaos. But this was the situation that's come out of Abu Dhabi 2021. So we're still seeing the after effects of that. Ironically, Michael Masi was in the paddock this weekend with I think it was the Australian Touring Cars series, because they support the Grand Prix when F1 is in Melbourne. And of course we had the safety car finish that kind of cheesed everybody off in Monza last year, when they probably could have restarted the race, to be honest, or thrown a red flag, the competition red flag, as we like to call it. And they did that. They did that today with 4 laps to go. They red flagged the race after Magnussen. That was a real bad misjudgment from K-Mag. He is prone to those. We saw it last year in those first lap collisions where he damaged his front wing. He would it was just a driving error. And a driver of his standards should be doing a little bit better. But that's why he's at Haas and not in a top team, because he makes those errors. And the top drivers, the very best drivers, they simply don't make those errors that often, at least. So we got the red flag, and that was quite fun. I mean, I'll be honest, my heart was going like an absolute trip hammer for that final restart, with the opportunity that Lewis Hamilton had to put a little bit right the wrong of Abu Dhabi 21. From his perspective, at least, it would have been a little bit of payback in Verstappen's direction. But the 2 restarts for Lewis were super fun, because he had 2 of his best buddies around him. He had Max Verstappen alongside him on the front row on both occasions, and Fernando Alonso sitting there waiting to pounce in P3. It couldn't have been a better situation for Lewis if he tried. So that final restart, just utter chaos. And we ended up with a safety car finish when the FIA have been trying not to have a safety car finish. And the thing is, if you're going to have a red flag restart with a couple of laps to go, you're generally going to have chaos. Especially when there's a harsh braking zone from a fairly decent run at it from Melbourne. If you think back to Baku, where they had the 2-lap sprint, okay, Hamilton made the error, but everyone got through there cleanly because it's a very short run. By the time they've got up to some sort of speed, they're already hitting the brakes. There's no point being too aggressive. But in Australia, you can get away with it a bit more. They could be a bit more proactive about things. And, well, it showed. We had Sargent run into the back of Nick de Vries. We had Sainz hit Alonso. The two Alpines collided. And then we had Lance Stroll go off all by himself at turn 3. So that's 4 separate incidents before they've reached turn 4. That is... it's just absolute... I don't understand. I don't understand. It is just madness. Now, the top question I have on my notes here is, are Mercedes back? They qualified 2nd and 3rd on the grid. They finished 2nd with Lewis Hamilton. They would probably have had 2 cars in the top 5 with George Russell making the checker flag, but he didn't. He had a power unit go pop. That was about 20 or something, wasn't it? So I'm wondering whether that's a consequence of the restart. Maybe he had an underlying issue in the power unit that just manifested itself because they had to go through the restart procedure and the heat soak and stuff. But obviously they've got all the machines to try and mitigate that as best they can, the teams. So unfortunate for George, but for Lewis, a great performance. And this was one of the interesting battles of the race, was Lewis fighting Fernando, but they weren't necessarily together on the track. They were battling each other through time, and there was that cat and mouse trying to keep Alonso out of the DRS zone, Alonso trying to get into the DRS zone. They're trying to pressure each other into using their tyres a bit more, especially Alonso. And the mind games over the radio. It was very interesting, and you had Sainz trying to close the gap, and Gasly was hanging out with the top guys as well. That was pretty good for the Alpine team. So, are Mercedes back? Who knows? I mean, we could go to Baku. It's lots of straights there. They struggle with top-end speed because I think their car is still a bit draggy. It just doesn't have the efficiency. But, of course, it is a sprint weekend, so anything can happen. I mean, we could have a couple more red flag scenarios. We've had several in Baku over the years, of course. So I'm not going to count chickens before they've hatched on Mercedes being back, but it was certainly a much stronger performance from them as a team. They got their act together in qualifying. Usually in qualifying we see them 5th, 6th, 7th over the last year and a half. But this time they got themselves right at the front, and it put them in a position to control the race. And okay, the race kind of got away from them, and it was always going to with the speed that Verstappen and the Red Bull team have. So they put themselves in the best possible position for a double podium. And that probably would have been the case. At least 2 cars in the top 5. Would Alonso have caught Russell if Hamilton had got through the 25-year-old? Possibly, who knows? But that would have been quite fun to watch. And someone who's kind of been forgotten a little bit in all of the chaos is Sergio Perez. And I think Perez should have done better. Yeah, he's finished P5, got driver of the day, and of course he would, because number one, he's a likeable chap. We like Checo Perez. He's our sort of driver to support on this channel. Go back and watch the video I did before the season where I took the driver personality test. It gave me Sergio Perez. But he's finished 5th in the car that's won the race. And I tell you now, obviously we saw what Verstappen did in Jeddah. If Verstappen had started from the pit lane in this race and had a red flag keep him in play, Verstappen would have finished on the podium. And this is what separates the number 2 drivers in top teams from the drivers that become world champions. Verstappen, Hamilton, Leclerc could probably do it. Alonso would probably do it. They would come through the field and they would end up on the podium when they're starting well out of position. Perez didn't do that. He's finished behind both Aston Martins. It took him to lap 40 to reach the Hülkenberg-Norris fight, which finished directly behind him. And okay, you get stuck in DRS trains, but this Red Bull breezes past cars like they're not even there. I don't think Perez made enough early progress. Maybe he was just being cautious, but Verstappen would have been on the fringes of the top 10 by lap 15, I think. And we saw that in Jeddah. We just saw the way he minced past people. But also I think the psychology of certain drivers coming through the field, the way Verstappen overtakes, whether you like it or not, it's effective. It gets him into the position he needs to be in. Perez maybe doesn't have that aura about him. He's very aggressive. He's good at overtaking. He put a couple of very nice moves together today. But I don't think that aura is there. And like with Hamilton, okay, Hamilton knows he mustn't wreck his car, but everyone knows he's going to come through. They know how good he is on the brakes. And the same like with Daniel Ricciardo. They knew he would just send one down the inside and you'd basically be better off jumping out the way and looking after your own race. So I think, all things considered, Perez maybe should have finished higher up the order. But he's finished 5th, and it's only it's a 15-point gain for Verstappen because Perez did get the fastest lap, which kind of, it does even it out from Jeddah. So it's a win and a second place and a fastest lap each, although Verstappen now has a second victory, Perez only 5th. Carlos Sainz. I think he's really, really unfortunate to be given a 5-second time penalty for an incident that happened at a standing restart. We see so often those little tangles, they generally go unpunished. And the thing is, Alonso wasn't out of the race. They reset the order. Alonso essentially got his position handed back to him for the second race in a row. An interesting quirk of the way that F1 works in the end for Alonso, handed back 3rd place for the 2nd week running. But Sainz, he did a good job. He recovered from being caught out by the first red flag. He'd pitted as well, like George Russell, and was set to go to the end, but the red flag meant he restarted in 11th. I don't think it's that bad a tangle. He's got in a bit deep. That's what happens at turn 1. You know, sometimes you get in a bit deep, but who knows, he might have had a bit of a nudge from behind. You never know. Okay, of course they've looked at it and he didn't get a nudge from behind, but Alonso's also coming back towards the right-hand side of the track to try and size up Hamilton. So, as always, it takes 2 to tango, and 2 to tangle in this case, and Alonso came out worse. So, he got his position back. I don't think the stewards, in their quest for consistency, have actually looked at the situation and gone, well, actually, it's just one of those things. It can just be a racing incident. It can just be an accident, and no one really, predominantly, to blame. And I think Carlos has every right to be aggrieved about that. And maybe the stewards should have waited to speak to him afterwards. Yeah, of course, we want results there and then, but we've also got a situation where potentially Max Verstappen is, I don't know if you've seen it on Twitter. By the time you hear this on audio, you probably will have. But at the moment, there's pictures of Verstappen ahead of the yellow line, and he's right on the front line of his grid box at the final restart. And you can see Hamilton, by comparison, is behind the yellow line with his front tyres. So is that in the box, out the box? What is that? I mean, for me, it looks like he'll get away with it because his front wheels are on the white line. But there's a sensor in that yellow line that figures whether you've jump started or not. So you tell me, is Max Verstappen bending the rules there as much as he can to make sure he gets the advantage? He's also angled his car to point across towards Hamilton because he knew what happened at the first start when he started on pole, and Mercedes had got up the inside, and he wasn't about to let that happen again. As it was, I don't think Hamilton got as good a start as Russell did at the beginning of the race, but you know, Verstappen could not take that chance, and he didn't. That's what sealed him the victory. The Alpine drivers who collided at that final restart have actually been summoned to the stewards, and this is significant because Pierre Gasly is, I think, 2 penalty points away from triggering a race ban. Let me just check the article. It's come through from the race. Here we go. Gasly close to ban. Does it say? Both drivers eliminated on the spot. He sits on 10, 2 away from the tally that would trigger an automatic ban for 12 penalty points. I mean, it's another one of those situations. It's Carnage is going off ahead of them. They're trying to avoid a car that's spun. There's cars now going at different speeds. Everyone's trying to pick up pace. And then you have this collision. That's just how it functions sometimes. And it was really disappointing for Gasly because he'd driven excellently up to that point. If he comes out of that performance with a race ban instead of a 5th place, that's a dramatic turn of fate, isn't it? So hopefully he doesn't get those penalty points. I don't even think it's worth a penalty in either direction, to be honest. It's just one of those things. Okay, we want things to be penalised, but only really when you've got like an obvious major error. But you know, the stewards, who knows what they're going to decide. They seem to be a law unto themselves at times. Let's talk about happier things though. McLaren, double points. They're off the mark in 2023. Lando Norris, a P6. They were one of the beneficiaries of the restart order being taken from lap 57 rather than how they entered the pit lane, because Nico Hülkenberg was actually in 4th place and would have ended up on the podium with Carlos Sainz's penalty, which Gunther Steiner must be absolutely doing his nut about, because Haas, well, they've never been on the podium, have they? And they've had such misfortune in Australia, and it would have been completely appropriate for them to get their first podium in Melbourne, considering how well they'd performed and then have things go wrong in Australia before. But Hulk had a great race. Another qualifying session where he got into Q3, and the battle between Hulk and Lando was excellent. It was very, very close. Hulk did move after Lando had moved on the first occasion towards down towards turn 11 now. It used to be turn 13, I believe. It was right on the edge of fair and penalisable. That's the sort of driving when there's a clear danger to other drivers. That's the sort of stuff we need to be clamping down on. And even a driver of Hülkenberg's experience can be caught out by that. But that's what happens with the super powerful DRS. You get these massive closing speeds and drivers can only react so quickly because they are human. But great result for McLaren and Lando Norris. Great result for Haas and Nico Hülkenberg. Does get McLaren above Haas, I believe, because Oscar Piastri finished in 8th position. Just going to double check the standings. Going to get them opened up over here on the other screen. So Red Bull are miles ahead. They're on 123 points. Aston Martin on 65. Let's scroll down to the bottom. Williams have fallen to the bottom of the standings, but that's because AlphaTauri now have a point thanks to Yuki Tsunoda's 10th place today, but they have a couple of 11th places up their sleeves. Had Alex Albon finished the race, I think he would have been well in the points. So Williams, their car is specific to certain circuits. They'll possibly be quite handy again in Baku. So it's not doom and gloom yet for Williams. Alfa Romeo also benefiting from the red flag. But just ending my point. Wow, look at this. So McLaren have leapt from last, and now they're ahead of Alpine. So all of a sudden things are looking much more rosy for McLaren. Alpine, that collision massively costly because they were set for 10 points. Ocon was 10th, so 11 points. They'd have got a bit closer to Ferrari. In fact, had they not collided and stayed on track, Gasly would have ended up in 4th and Ocon in 9th. So they had really closed the gap on Ferrari, but neither of those teams scored points today. But McLaren off the mark with 6th and 8th. Zhou Guanyu 9th. Yuki Tsunoda 10th. So Alfa Romeo up to 6 points. Alfa Tauri off the mark as well. After 3 rounds, all 10 teams have now scored points, which is always good to see. We don't like teams being on the bottom on 0. Always good for teams to be scoring points. What else have I got noted down? The chaos at the end should not overshadow what was an interesting race. And as I said, it was an interesting race with action and battles all the way through. Okay, it was primarily made by fast cars being out of position, namely Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz, but still, there was some cases where the DRS worked perfectly. It put a car in a position where they had to outbrake the other driver. And Jenson Button mentioned this, and Glenn Freeman at the race mentioned this on Twitter. When it's just a drive-by, and that was the situation for the lead. As soon as you saw Verstappen's rear wing pop open, it was a done deal. You knew he was going to go past. Yes, the Red Bull's DRS system is very effective, but the DRS should not be just pass go and collect 200 like in Monopoly, which it is in some cases. But there were occasions, Carlos Sainz on Gasly, there was a couple I think with Perez, and maybe the fight with Lando Norris and Nico Hulkenberg. You had to put yourself in a position to get the job done through driver skill. It wasn't just, oh yeah, I've got my rear wing open and you haven't, see you later. But what it does do actually is keep fights alive. Gasly was able to hang with Sainz, and obviously the Alpine is good in a straight line and good with the DRS, so that was helpful for them. But all through the field we had Tsunoda battling with other drivers. Who else was battling? Piastri was battling with Tsunoda as well, wasn't he? So when it works really well. It does what it's supposed to, but that is becoming more and more and more and more infrequent. But still an interesting race. As I spoke about with the Alonso-Hamilton duel, they weren't wheel to wheel, but they were still having to battle each other. And what could have made this race with that before the red flags at the end, what could have made this race a touch more interesting is that extra jeopardy on strategy. There was constant talk of, will they have to pit again? Can the tyres make it to the end? They know the tyres can make it to the end. They run a lap time. They all run a lap time to get them to the end. So it was very unlikely that anyone would go for a 2-stop because you just lose so much track time because of the slow pit lane. That's the nature of the beast. You're going to get 1-stop strategies in places. So I think they need to do something where the tyres are just going to degrade a bit more. They need to be maybe go a bit more down the route of the 2011 spec Pirellis and force these multi-stop strategies, because it just throws that extra element. If we'd got to about lap 35 and the tyres were falling off and we get a second round of pit stops between 35 and 40, who goes for the undercut? Is anyone going to be brave enough and go for the overcut? You've got those situations coming into play because you've got to do it. So it's disappointing when it's a straightforward, almost one-stop race, because once the stop is made, it's all out on the track, which is fine. That's where we want the action to be, but also that strategical element needs to be in play as well, because that when you've got the battle on the track and in the pit lane, that's what makes the racing really, really interesting. Like we see in Bahrain from time to time, the racing there is very, very close, and the undercut is super powerful. So timing a pit stop right is crucial. So I'm going to leave it there for today. I've got a couple of other videos to record that will come out later this week. I'm putting together a podcast with Peter on Pole, where we spoke about McLaren, we spoke about Ferrari, and we spoke about Mercedes having poor starts to the 2023 season. Happily, Mercedes and McLaren have had good weekends in Melbourne Less happily, Ferrari have scored no points and looked thoroughly fourth best. Leclerc having a wretched weekend and Sainz doing his best to come back through the order, but would have always finished behind Fernando Alonso in a straightforward race, I think. So difficult weekend for the Scuderia. Of course, let me know your comments on the race. Let me know what you rate the race out of 10. I've given it 7.5 out of 10. Let me know if you agree, disagree, whatever. And make sure you give the video a thumbs up for me. Subscribe for more Grand Prix content. I'll try and have videos out every Tuesday and Thursday. It's just not possible to have it any more regularly than that. So this week we'll have the reaction to Formula E going underwater. We'll have, not as in going out of business, but they're actually going to be racing underwater. The driver ratings for the Melbourne Grand Prix, the Formula 2 top drivers. I haven't actually watched the feature race at the time of this recording, nor the Formula 3 feature race, so I'm going to go and do that now, and then I can start putting that together. So that will be coming out over the next few days. Of course, have a lovely week. I'm going on holiday, so those videos will come out. Maybe I'll put them together in the evenings while I'm relaxing on holiday. We'll see. But that's all for now. Like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter and Instagram. You can find all the links down below. And have a great week, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the Australian Grand Prix instant reaction, and I will see you again very, very soon. It's bye for now.